The auctioneer's hammer came down so hard it cracked the wooden podium. $600, the man in the black coat announced, and the crowd went silent, not from respect, but from shock. Samuel Thornton stood at the edge of this crowd, with his arms crossed, and a smirk carved into his face like something permanent. He had been there all morning, watching, waiting. He had expected to walk away with the Voss girl's labor contract for $50. Maybe 60. She was big, plain, and the daughter of a dead gambler. Nobody wanted her. That was the whole point, but Wade Mercer had just paid $600 for her. Thornton's smirk didn't disappear. It shifted into something colder, something that looked almost like a decision being made. He turned to the man beside him, his foreman, Cleet, and said quietly, "Write that down. Mercer's lost his mind." Nobody thought much of it at the time. They should have. If you've ever been told you were too much, too big, too loud, too different, too broken to be worth anything, then you already know Elena Voss before I say another word. Stay with me. Because what happened to this girl on the worst day of her life will change the way you see everything you think you know about strength. Subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and tell me in the comments, what city, what country are you watching from right now? I want to see how far this story travels, because Elena's story deserves to go everywhere. The morning of the auction, Elena Voss woke up before the sun. Not because she wanted to. She hadn't wanted much of anything in the 3 weeks since they'd buried her father in the hard ground behind the house, the same ground that would be taken from her before noon. She woke up because the cold got through the walls, and the walls were thin, and she had run out of wood for the stove 2 days ago. She lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling and tried to remember if there was anything left in the kitchen worth eating. There wasn't. She already knew that. She had checked last night. She had checked the night before that. She had been checking for 2 weeks, each time hoping she had miscounted or missed something, each time finding the same bare shelves and the same silence and the same dull weight in her chest that she was starting to think might just be her permanent condition now. Her father's name had been Georg Voss, and he had been many things in his life: charming, careless, funny in the way that people are funny when they are afraid to be serious, and deeply, catastrophically bad with money. He had loved Elena in his way. She believed that. She held on to that. But loving someone and protecting them are not the same thing, and Georg Voss had spent 15 years proving that particular difference in spectacular fashion. The gambling had started small. It always did. A card game in town, just for entertainment. A bet on a horse race, nothing serious. Then the loans. Then the second loans to cover the first loans. Then the creditors who came to the door with polite voices that turned hard when Georg wasn't home, who looked at Elena with eyes that told her exactly what they thought of her chances. When Georg died, quietly, in his sleep, from a heart that had simply worn out, he left Elena, an 18-year-old girl with no money, no relatives, and a farm that technically belonged to 3 different men in town. She had tried to negotiate. She had gone to each of them with her father's ledgers and a list of what the property was worth, and a proposal for a payment arrangement she had stayed up 3 nights writing out by hand. The first man had laughed. The second had told her to come back when she had someone with her, a husband, a brother, some man who could speak for her. The third had looked her up and down the way men sometimes did when they thought they were being subtle about it, which he wasn't, and said the farm would be auctioned off within the month. The labor contract had been his idea, or rather, it had been the idea of the town's debt arbitrator, a thin man named Hoskins, who smelled of pipe tobacco and wore the same brown coat every day, regardless of weather. He had explained it to Elena in the flat, procedural tone of someone who had delivered this particular speech many times. A labor contract meant her debt would be assigned to whoever purchased the contract. They would pay off what she owed in exchange for a fixed period of labor, typically 2 years, sometimes 3. She would receive room, board, and a small wage. At the end of the contract, she would be free and clear. "It's legal," Hoskins had said, as if that settled it. "It's orderly. And frankly, Miss Voss, it is the only option available to you." She had wanted to argue. She had sat in that chair across from his desk and felt the argument building in her throat, the one about how this wasn't right, how she wasn't a piece of property to be auctioned off, how her father's debts were not her debts, and the law should have more to say about that. But she hadn't said it. Because Hoskins was right in his flat procedural way. It was the only option. The alternative was to walk out of his office with nothing and disappear into a West that ate people whole when they had nowhere to go. So she had signed the paper. And now it was morning, and the auction was in 3 hours, and Elena Voss sat up in her cold, empty house and started braiding her hair. The auction was held in the yard behind Hoskins's office, which was also behind the feed store, which meant the whole thing smelled of grain and animal and something Elena couldn't identify and didn't want to. There were maybe 40 people. Some had come deliberately. Others had drifted over from the main street out of curiosity, the way people in small towns always drifted toward anything that broke the routine of a Tuesday morning. Elena recognized some faces. She avoided making eye contact with most of them. She stood on a low wooden platform that had been built for this purpose. That was the thing she couldn't quite absorb, that someone had built a platform for this, that this was routine enough to require permanent infrastructure, and she kept her hands folded in front of her and her face as still as she could make it. The comments started almost immediately. She heard them the way you hear rain on a roof. Not every individual drop, but the cumulative effect of all of them together. Phrases that floated up from the crowd and landed on her whether she wanted them to or not. That's Georg Voss's girl? Big, ain't she? Who's gonna want? Heard she tried to argue with Henderson about the deed, can you imagine? No husband, no family, wonder how she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth and kept her eyes fixed on the middle distance, on a point somewhere above the crowd's heads, on nothing in particular. Hoskins read the terms of the contract. 2 years. Labor to be specified by the purchasing party within reasonable limits. Room and board included. A small monthly wage to be held in trust until contract completion. The bidding started at $20. It sat there for a long moment. Nobody moved. Then a man in a gray coat bid $25, not because he seemed particularly interested, but because the silence had become uncomfortable. Someone else bid $30, and then the man in the gray coat dropped out, and it was just the second bidder at $30. And Elena watched Hoskins's face do the careful, neutral calculation of a man who was wondering if this was going to be a very short auction. That was when Samuel Thornton spoke. He didn't raise his hand the way the others had. He just said, from his position at the edge of the crowd, in a carrying voice that seemed designed to be heard, $40, and that's generous. A few people laughed, not at him, at her. Elena's jaw tightened. She didn't look at Thornton directly. She had seen men like Thornton before. Men who understood that cruelty worked better when it was delivered lightly, as a joke, as a casual observation, because then the target couldn't even object without looking like they lacked a sense of humor. 42, someone said. 45, said Thornton, still with that easy tone. The bidding climbed slowly, haltingly, the way bidding does when nobody is particularly invested in the outcome. Thornton kept participating, not urgently, but steadily, like a man who was willing to pay the minimum amount necessary to make a point. By the time it reached $80, the pool had narrowed to Thornton and a heavy-set farmer from outside of town who looked like he needed help with harvest labor and wasn't fussy about the source. At 90, the farmer hesitated. At 95, he dropped out. And then, from the left side of the crowd, a voice Elena had never heard before said, $600. The silence was total, complete. The kind of silence that only happens when something has shocked an entire crowd simultaneously, when every person present feels the surprise at the same moment, and no one has yet figured out how to respond. Elena turned her head. The man was tall, which she noticed first. Dark coat, worn at the elbows. He had the look of someone who had once been careful about his appearance and then had a period in his life that had interrupted that habit and hadn't quite returned to it yet. He was maybe 35, 40. His face was difficult to read. Not blank exactly, but controlled. Like a man who had learned to keep his reactions on a short leash. He was looking at her. Not the way the others had been looking at her. Not with the assessing, dismissive, vaguely amused look she had been collecting all morning. He was looking at her the way you look at something you're trying to understand. It was unsettling. Hoskins said, I'm sorry, can you state your name for the record? Wade Mercer, the man said. Mercer Ranch, up in the Caldwell Valley. I'll pay $600 for the contract. Another ripple went through the crowd. She could feel the shift, the sudden repositioning of everyone's assumptions, including her own. Wade Mercer. She knew that name. Everyone in the county knew that name. Mercer Ranch had been one of the biggest operations in the valley 15 years ago, before his wife died, before whatever happened. She had heard it described in town in the past tense, what it used to be, what it could have been. Thornton's face had gone completely still. Hoskins, after a moment's recovery, said, $600. Do I hear? He paused, looked at Thornton, looked at the room. Going once. Going twice. Thornton said nothing. Sold. She didn't speak to Wade Mercer for the first 15 minutes after the auction ended. She signed the paperwork with Hoskins. Her hand was steadier than she expected. And then she stood to the side while the legal transfer was processed, and she watched Wade Mercer stand a careful distance away with his hat in his hands, looking at the ground. He looked like a man who had just done something impulsive and was now quietly coming to terms with it. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. When Hoskins finally released them both, Wade walked over to her and said, without preamble, "I've got a wagon out front. It's a long drive to Caldwell Valley." "I know where Caldwell Valley is," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Do you have things to collect?" "No," she said. The word came out flat, and she meant it to. There was nothing left in the house worth carrying. The creditors had already tagged most of it. She had her coat, her one bag, and the braid she'd done that morning that was already starting to come undone at the back. "All right," he said. He turned and walked toward the front of the building. She followed, because that was the arrangement now. That was what the paper said. She didn't look back at the house as they drove out of town. She had told herself she wouldn't, and she managed it, mostly by fixing her gaze on the horizon in front of them and thinking about nothing in particular with a kind of aggressive focus. Wade drove. He didn't talk, which she appreciated. The horse was a solid bay with a calm temperament, and the wagon was old but maintained, and the road out of town was rough in the places she remembered it being rough. And eventually the town fell away behind them, and there was just the land and the sky and the silence between two strangers who had just entered into a legal arrangement neither of them had expected this morning. After about an hour, he said, "You should probably know what you're getting into." "You could have mentioned that before the auction," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to it. "That's fair," he said. He kept his eyes on the road. "The ranch is in bad shape. I'm not going to tell you it isn't, because you'll see it when we get there, and there's no point in starting out with a lie. The house is livable. Mostly. There's staff, some of them, but we've been short-handed for a while." He paused. "And there are my children, twins, Mara and Eli. They're 12. "Okay," Elena said. He stopped again, started over. "Their mother died 4 years ago. They've had a difficult time. They're going to be resistant to you being there." "You mean they're going to be awful to me," Elena said. He didn't deny it. "I'm asking you to be patient with them." She looked out at the road. "What exactly do you expect me to do, Mr. Mercer? On the ranch? What's the work?" He seemed slightly surprised by the directness of the question. "Household management mainly, cooking, supplies, making sure things run in the house. I've got ranch hands for the outdoor work, though I'm down to 4 and they've been stretched thin. What I don't have is anyone who can keep the inside of that operation from falling apart." "And you thought I could do that?" "I thought you might," he said carefully. "You came with a recommendation." She turned to look at him. "What recommendation? From whom?" He hesitated. "Hoskins mentioned you'd tried to negotiate the property dispute yourself. Said you'd come in with ledgers and paperwork and a payment proposal." "He laughed at me," she said. "He told me about it," Wade said. "That's different." She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. They drove in silence for another long while, and the mountains started to show themselves in the distance. And Elena Voss sat in the wagon that was carrying her toward a life she hadn't chosen and thought about what it meant that the one person in that whole town who had seen what she'd done, who had heard about the ledgers and the proposal and the 3 nights of careful work, and decided it was worth something was a stranger who hadn't even been there. Mercer Ranch appeared at the end of a long dirt road lined with scrub and dry grass, and Elena's first honest reaction was that it looked like a place that had been great and knew it, and resented what it had become. The main house was large, had been large, the bones of it were impressive. But the porch railing was missing 2 posts, and the paint had weathered down to bare wood in patches, and there were outbuildings that had clearly been left to go half to ruin. The yard was functional, but not tended. Everything about it said, "We are surviving here. We are not flourishing." She had expected that. He had warned her. What she hadn't expected were the twins. Mara and Eli Mercer were standing on the porch when the wagon pulled in, and they were both looking at Elena with the particular expression of children who have decided something in advance and are waiting for reality to confirm it. Mara was the one who spoke first. She was small for 12, dark-haired like her father, and she had the eyes of someone who had learned to assess threats early. "You're the one he bought," she said. It was not a question. Elena looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I'm Elena Voss. You must be Mara." "I know who I am," Mara said. Eli, who was taller than his sister and had a softer face, said nothing. He was looking at Elena with something that was harder to read, less hostile maybe, but more wary, like a dog that had been startled too many times and had learned that stillness was safer than reaction. Wade stepped down from the wagon and said quietly, "Mara." "It's true, isn't it?" Mara said without looking at him. "You paid money for her." "It's a labor contract," he said. "It's a legal arrangement." "That's what it's called," Mara said. The silence stretched. Elena picked up her bag from the wagon and walked to the porch steps. She didn't wait for an invitation. She didn't ask permission. She just walked up the steps, stopped at the top, and looked at Mara with the same level gaze she had used all morning in that auction yard. "I'm not here to replace your mother," she said. "I'm not here to pretend to be anything I'm not. I'm here to work. You don't have to like me." Mara stared at her. "But I'm going to be here," Elena continued. "That's already decided. So we can either make this easy or we can make it hard. That part's up to you." Mara's chin came up. Her expression said she had chosen hard, and she had chosen it deliberately, and she wanted Elena to know it. Elena nodded once, as if that was the answer she'd expected, and turned to Wade. "Which room is mine?" The room was small. The mattress was thin. The window had a crack in the frame that let in a thin line of cold air that she could already tell would be miserable by winter. She sat on the edge of the bed after Wade had shown her around and left her to settle in, and she looked at her one bag on the floor, and she thought, "This is it. This is what you have now." It wasn't self-pity, exactly. She had moved past self-pity somewhere in the middle of the drive, in one of those silent stretches where the road was long and the mountains were far and there was nothing to do but sit with the truth of things. It was more like taking inventory. The way you look at what's in a room before you start cleaning it, before you can make any decisions about what to do with it. She had a roof. She had a job. She had 2 years. People had survived worse. She took off her boots and set them beside the bed and lay down on top of the covers without undressing, because the room was cold enough that she didn't want to lose the warmth she had. And she stared at the ceiling, and she thought about the ledgers she had put together for Henderson's office. The ones he'd dismissed, the ones Hoskins had apparently told Wade Mercer about. She was good with numbers. She always had been. Her father had been terrible with them, which meant that from the time she was 12 she had been the one tracking what came in and what went out, trying to make the math work when the math refused to cooperate. She had failed, in the end. You couldn't balance a ledger when the person making the debts refused to stop making them. But she had learned something in the trying. She had learned how to read a financial picture, how to find where things were going wrong. Mercer Ranch was going wrong. Wade had said so himself. She had seen it in the yard, in the outbuildings, in the way the ranch hands she'd spotted in the distance moved with the energy of men who were stretched too thin and knew it. She didn't know yet why it was going wrong, but she would find out. That was the thing about being underestimated your entire life. People left things lying around when they didn't think you were watching. Documents, conversations, the shape of problems they assumed you couldn't understand. Elena Voss had spent 18 years watching. She was just now, finally, in a position to do something about what she saw. She closed her eyes, and the wind came through the crack in the window frame, and somewhere in the house she could hear Mara's footsteps, deliberate, defiant, refusing to be quiet. And Elena Voss, the girl who had been bought for $600, fell asleep with her coat still on and her mind still working. She woke before dawn again, which was becoming a habit she hadn't asked for. The crack in the window frame had done exactly what she'd predicted. By 3 in the morning, the cold had worked its way through her coat and settled into her shoulders, and sleep had become a negotiation she was losing. She lay there for a while in the gray dark, listening to the sounds of a house she didn't know yet. The particular creak of the floorboards, the way the wind moved around the corners of the building, the distant, intermittent sound of cattle, low and restless, somewhere out past the east fence. She got up. There was no point in lying there conducting an argument with insomnia she was going to lose anyway. The kitchen was cold and unorganized in a way that told her immediately that it had been unorganized for a long time. Not the disorder of a recent crisis, but the settled, encrusted disorder of years of no one being fully in charge of it. There were supplies, but they were stored with no particular logic. Flour and salt next to a tin of nails, dried beans in a bucket that also contained a hammer. 3 different half-empty sacks of something she had to open and smell before she could identify it as cornmeal. She found a lamp, found oil, found a match after checking 4 different places, and lit it. Then she stood in the kitchen with the lamp in her hand and looked at the room the way she used to look at her father's ledgers. Not with emotion, but with the particular focused attention that comes from knowing that what you see right now is the truth of a situation, before anyone has had the chance to explain it away. The truth of this kitchen was, nobody had been taking care of things here for a long time. She found wood for the stove. It took her 20 minutes to locate it, stacked outside a door she initially thought was a closet, and another 10 to get the fire going because the stove's damper was positioned wrong, and she had to adjust it twice before the smoke decided to go up the chimney instead of into the room. Her eyes were watering, and she smelled like wood smoke by the time she had it working, and she sat down in one of the kitchen chairs and just breathed for a minute. Then she got up and started breakfast. She had cooked for her father for 6 years. She knew how to make something from not quite enough, how to stretch dried beans with what you had, how to make cornbread in a pan when there was no proper baking equipment, how to make coffee strong enough to be worth drinking when the grounds were old. These were not elegant skills. They were survival skills, and she had them the way you have things you learned young, in the marrow. By the time the sky started to lighten, she had a pot of beans going. They'd been soaking in water she'd found in the rain barrel outside, which was a risk she'd taken, and cornbread in the pan, and coffee on the stove, and the kitchen was warm for the first time in what she guessed had been a while based on the way it resisted the warmth, the way cold that has been present for a long time resists being moved out. She heard footsteps upstairs, then on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate. A man's footsteps. Wade Mercer appeared in the kitchen doorway and stopped. He looked at the stove, the pot, the pan, the cup of coffee she had already poured and set on the table. He looked at all of it for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, and then he said, "You didn't have to do this." "I know," she said. "There's coffee." He came in and picked up the cup and stood by the stove, and she noticed that he positioned himself there not primarily for warmth, but because the stove was solid and real, and standing next to something solid was apparently what he needed in the morning before he'd fully committed to the day. She filed that away. "Beans will be another hour," she said. "Cornbread's almost done." He nodded, drank his coffee. "The hands eat in the bunkhouse, usually. Lou, that's my oldest hand. He handles the cooking out there. But you'll meet them today if you want." "I want," she said. He looked at her. "You want to meet the ranch hands?" "I need to understand how things work here," she said. "The whole operation, not just the kitchen." There was a pause. She could see him recalibrating something, the version of her he had expected, adjusting to the version that was actually standing in front of him with a spatula at 5:30 in the morning asking to meet the ranch hands. "All right," he said finally, "after breakfast. Us." The morning revealed itself in pieces, the way truth usually does. She met the 4 ranch hands. Lou, who was in his 60s and had the face of a man who had made peace with the outdoors and its demands. A younger man named Dex, who was polite in the careful way of someone who has been told to be polite to a specific person and is following instructions. And 2 brothers, Cobb and Reel, who were quiet in the way of men who communicated primarily through labor and distrusted words as a general principle. Lou shook her hand and looked her in the eye and said, "Welcome to the circus," which she appreciated for its honesty. She asked questions that surprised them. Not household questions, not about laundry or meal schedules or where things were kept. She asked about the cattle count, which Lou told her after a slight hesitation. She asked about the fencing on the east pasture, which Dex said needed work, but they hadn't had time. She asked about the water situation, the winter feed stores, the condition of the equipment in the main barn. They answered. Cautiously at first, then more directly, because her questions were specific and they were men who respected specific questions more than general ones. Wade stood slightly to the side during this, not interfering, watching her in that same difficult-to-read way he'd used the day before at the auction. She didn't ask him to explain her interest to the hands. She didn't look to him for validation of the questions. She just asked them and listened to the answers and said thank you and moved on to the next thing. The twins came down to breakfast late. She heard them on the stairs, the lighter tread of Mara first, then Eli's slower, more deliberate pace, and she was back at the stove when they appeared in the doorway. She didn't make a production of acknowledging them. She said, "There's food on the table," without turning around, because she had been 12 once, and she knew that being looked at too directly when you were in a contrary mood made the contrary mood worse. She heard chairs scrape, the small sounds of two children deciding to sit down and eat despite their intentions not to. Mara ate fast, with the focused intensity of someone fueling up rather than enjoying a meal. Eli ate slower. How was the one who said, after a while, "How come you know how to make cornbread like this?" She turned around. He was looking at his plate with the careful casualness of a child who had asked a genuine question and was now worried about being seen to be curious. "My mother used to make it," she said, "before she died. I was about your age when I learned." A silence. "When did your mother die?" Eli asked. "Eli," Mara said sharply. "It's all right," Elena said. "I was 6. Another silence. Longer. "Ours died 4 years ago," Eli said. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry." Mara's jaw tightened. She pushed back from the table and picked up her plate and took it to the basin without being asked, which was the behavior of a child who had been doing things for herself for a long time and left the kitchen without speaking. Eli sat for a moment longer. Then he said quietly, so his sister wouldn't hear from whatever room she'd gone to, "She makes everything harder than it has to be." "She's protecting herself," Elena said. "That's not the same thing as being difficult." He thought about that. She could see him thinking about it, turning it over the way children do when an adult says something that catches them slightly off guard. Then he got up and took his plate to the basin too, and followed his sister out. Elena stood in the kitchen alone with the sound of the stove and thought, "That's 2 conversations. That's more than I expected on the second day." The real trouble with Mercer Ranch didn't announce itself all at once. It came to her in the way that real problems always did. Not as a sudden revelation, but as an accumulation of small things that started to add up wrong. The first was the supply ledger. She found it on the 3rd day, in a drawer in Wade's office. A room she had permission to enter because he had told her she'd need access to the household accounts to manage supplies. The ledger was there along with a stack of receipts and several loose papers that had been stuffed in without any particular organization. She sat down at the desk and went through it the way her father had never gone through his own ledgers. Methodically, from the beginning, looking at each entry with the question, "Does this make sense?" By the time she reached the 3rd month of the current year, she had 4 entries circled in her head that didn't make sense. Not dramatically. Nothing so obvious as large sums going to unknown recipients. Just small things. Supply orders that were larger than the ranch's current operations seemed to require. Payments to vendors she didn't recognize from Lou or the others. Expenditures categorized as maintenance that had no corresponding record of what had been maintained. She went back to the beginning and read again, more carefully. By the end of the afternoon, she had filled 2 pages of a spare piece of paper with notes. The numbers weren't wrong on their face, but they were wrong in the aggregate. The ranch was spending more than it should on inputs and receiving less in return than it should from outputs. And the gap between those 2 things was too consistent, too steady, too regular to be accident or incompetence. This wasn't a ranch that was failing because Wade Mercer was a bad manager. This was a ranch that was being bled. She sat with that thought for a long time, in the quiet of the office, with the afternoon light changing on the desk around her. Then she put her notes in her coat pocket, closed the ledger, and went to find Wade. "I was in the barn with Dex, looking at a horse that had thrown a shoe and was favoring its left foreleg. She waited in the doorway until he looked up. He came over when he saw her face. 'What is it?' he said. She looked at Dex, who took the hint and found something to do at the far end of the barn. 'I've been looking at the supply ledger,' she said, keeping her voice low and level. 'The household accounts.' 'Okay,' he said. 'Who is Pemberton Supply?' she asked. He frowned. Where did you see that? In the ledger. There are 7 payments to Pemberton Supply going back 14 months. The amounts are consistent, always between $40 and $60. Nothing next to them in the record says what was delivered. His frown deepened. He was thinking. She could see him going through memory, looking for a Pemberton Supply, not finding it. That doesn't... He stopped. I didn't authorize anything to a supplier by that name. I know, she said. That's why I'm telling you. The silence between them was different from the ones they'd had in the wagon. This one had weight. She watched him absorb what she was saying, not just the specific information, but the implication of it, which was larger and harder. There are other entries that concern me, she said. I want to go through the full ledger with you, but not tonight. Tonight I need you to tell me, is there anyone who has access to these accounts besides you? He was very still. My foreman, Harlan Pike. He handled the accounts when I was sick last winter, and He stopped. He's been with me for 8 years. I'm not saying it's him, she said carefully. I'm saying someone with access has been making unauthorized purchases. That's what the numbers say. Wade looked at the floor. He had the expression of a man who was doing a very unpleasant kind of math in his head, the kind where you add up small things you had noticed and dismissed over a period of years and suddenly see what they total. Where's Harlan now? She asked. He was in town this morning. He said he had personal business. She thought about that. Where in town? He looked up at her. Why? Samuel Thornton lives in town, she said. Another silence. Longer. She let it sit there. She wasn't going to push it. She didn't have proof, and she knew the difference between a pattern that suggests something and evidence that confirms it, and right now all she had was the pattern. Wade said quietly, I need to see the ledger. Tonight, she said, after the children are in bed. He nodded. Once, slowly, the way a man nods when he's accepting something he doesn't want to accept. She turned to go back to the house. Then he said, behind her, Elena. She stopped. How did you find it? He said. But the Pemberton entries, you'd only been in that ledger for one afternoon. She looked back at him. I know what looking for mistakes in numbers feels like, she said. I've been doing it since I was 12. She left him standing in the barn doorway with that. The ledger session lasted 3 hours. Wade sat across from her at the office desk, and she walked him through it. Entry by entry, the way she had once walked through her own father's accounts, looking for the place where it had all started to go wrong. She had her notes from the afternoon, and she added to them as they went. Wade confirmed what he recognized and flagged what he didn't, and by 10 o'clock they had identified 17 entries across the past 14 months that he had not authorized and could not explain. 17. Each one modest, each one easy to miss. Together, they totaled just over $900. $900, he said, when she wrote the final sum at the bottom of her page. He said it like a man repeating something in a language he's still translating. That we can confirm, she said. There may be more that I haven't identified yet. He sat back. His jaw was set in a way that told her he was furious and was managing it through compression, pushing it down and keeping it there through sheer force of will. I should have caught this, he said. You were running a ranch and raising 2 children alone, she said, and someone was deliberately making it hard to see. It doesn't excuse it, she said, but it's not stupidity, it's not negligence. Someone was patient and careful, and they knew exactly what they were doing. He looked at her across the desk. You think this is Thornton? I think you should find out who Harlan was meeting in town today before you decide anything, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. The lamp between them put shadows in all the wrong places, under his eyes, along the line of his jaw. And he looked older than he had that afternoon, or maybe just more tired, like a man who had been carrying something for 4 years and was only now allowing himself to feel the weight of it. You've been here 4 days, he said. I know. And you found this in 4 days. The numbers were there, she said. I just read them. He shook his head, not at her, at something larger, or maybe at himself. Why are you doing this, he said. You could have just... The contract doesn't require you to... I know what the contract requires, she said. This isn't about the contract. He waited. She wasn't sure how much to say, and then decided she'd rather say too much than leave him with a question he'd keep asking. I spent 6 years watching my father's farm fall apart because someone should have looked at the numbers and nobody did, she said. And then the farm was gone, and he was gone, and I was standing in an auction yard in the same town where everyone had already decided what I was worth. So no, Mr. Mercer, it's not about the contract. It's about the fact that I can see what's happening here, and I'm not going to pretend I can't. She said it plainly, without drama, and then she closed the ledger and set her pencil down and waited. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Wade." She looked at him. "My name," he said. "You can use it." Harlan Pike came back from town the next afternoon. Elena watched him from the kitchen window. A broad-shouldered man in his 50s with the rolling, careful gait of someone who was always slightly aware of who was watching. She had asked Lou about him that morning, phrasing it as a general question about the ranch operation, keeping it light. Lou had said Harlan was capable and reliable, and had paused before reliable in a way that was slight but present, and Elena had heard the pause. She stayed in the kitchen when Harlan came in. She didn't introduce herself. He'd heard she was there, obviously, and he came to the kitchen doorway and looked her over with an evaluation that was more thorough than he tried to make it seem. "You're the Voss girl," he said. "Elena," she said, without turning from the stove. "Right," he said. And then, almost as an afterthought, "You been spending time in the office?" She turned around then, because she wanted to see his face when she answered. "Wade asked me to go through the household accounts," she said, "get a sense of the supply situation." His expression didn't change much. That was the tell, the effort it took to keep it from changing. A man with nothing to hide would have reacted more naturally, even if just with mild curiosity. Harlan Pike showed her the face of a man who had practiced this. "Makes sense," he said. And he left. She turned back to the stove and stood there for a moment with her hand on the handle of the pot and thought, He knows I found something, which means he'll move, which means she had less time than she'd thought." The crisis came 3 days later, and it had nothing to do with Harlan Pike. Eli woke with a fever at 2 in the morning. She heard him coughing through the wall, a wrong sound, the dry, rasping quality of lungs working too hard. And by the time she reached his room, his skin was hot enough that she didn't need a thermometer to know this was serious. Mara was already awake, standing in the corner of the room with her arms crossed in the exact posture of someone who was terrified and refusing to show it. "How long has he been coughing?" Elena asked. "I don't know," Mara said. "I woke up and he was already—" "Go get your father," Elena said. "I can handle—" "Mara, go get your father now." Something in her voice, not loud, not angry, just the tone of someone who had decided, made Mara go. Elena got Eli sitting upright, which helped the coughing, and found an extra blanket and packed it around him, and felt his forehead again and thought, "Too hot. This is too hot for something that will just pass." Wade appeared in the doorway with Mara behind him, and his face when he saw Eli went through 3 things very fast: fear, and then the compression of fear, and then the deliberate steadiness of a father who understood that panicking in front of his sick child would make everything worse. "He needs a doctor," Elena said. "Nearest doctor is in Crestfall," Wade said. "That's 4 hours in good weather." She looked at him. The window was black, deep night, no moon she could see. "Can you ride it?" she said. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "Then go," she said. "I'll stay with them." He went. She heard him moving through the house, the sounds of a man dressing fast, the kitchen door, the barn, the horse. Then hooves on the dirt road, fading. Mara stood in the doorway of Eli's room and said, in a voice that was working very hard to be steady, "He's going to be all right." Elena didn't offer empty reassurance. She had been given empty reassurance when her mother was sick, and she had known it was empty and it had made her feel more alone, not less. "His fever's high," she said. "We need to keep it from going higher. Can you get me the coldest water we have and some cloth?" Something shifted in Mara's face. The offer of something to do, something specific, something that mattered, cut through the helplessness in a way that comfort wouldn't have. "Yes," she said, and she went. They worked through the rest of the night together. Elena and Mara trading off the cold compresses, keeping Eli awake when the fever peaked, and he started to drift in ways that worried her, talking to him, telling him things, anything, just keeping his attention tethered to the room. Mara told him about a horse she wanted. Elena told him about a summer she'd spent learning to fish badly in a creek near the Voss farm. Eli listened with the unfocused eyes of a feverish child and said, at one point, "You're not as bad as Mara said." "Eli," Mara said sharply. "It's okay," Elena said. She looked at Mara across the bed, in the lamplight, and Mara looked back at her with an expression that was about 6 different things at once. I know what she thought. "What did I think?" Mara said, and it came out more genuine than confrontational. An actual question from a girl who was too exhausted for her defenses to be working properly. "That I was a threat," Elena said. "That I was another person who was going to come in and try to take up space that wasn't mine. That the best thing to do was make it hard enough that I'd leave." Mara was quiet. "I understand it," Elena said. "It was smart. It just wasn't right." "You stayed anyway," Mara said. "I always stay," Elena said. That was all she said. She turned back to Eli and adjusted the compress on his forehead, and Mara sat in the chair by the window and pulled her knees up to her chest, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, but the silence had changed quality, was different from what it had been the first 2 nights in this house. The doctor arrived with Wade just before noon. He was a compact, brisk man named Albright, who examined Eli thoroughly and declared it a serious respiratory infection, the kind that went bad fast in children and required rest and specific treatment. He left medicines and instructions and told Wade that Eli would recover fully if the fever broke within 48 hours. "It's already coming down," Elena told him. "We've been keeping him cool." Albright looked at her, then at the room. The organized medicines she'd found in the kitchen, the clean compresses, the record she'd kept on a piece of paper by the bed of Eli's temperature at each hour through the night. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. "Since 2 this morning," she said. He looked at Wade. Something passed between them. Then Albright said, "He's lucky you were paying attention." After the doctor left, Wade found Elena in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold while she wasn't paying attention, staring at nothing in particular with the specific vacancy of someone running on no sleep and high adrenaline that had finally finished burning off. He set a plate of food in front of her. She looked at it. "Lou made it," he said. "I asked him." She looked at the plate. Biscuits, bacon, something that was probably gravy. She hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it without complication, which was a different kind of thank you from the one she usually managed. He sat across from her. "Mara told me," he said, "what you did last night. How you—" She said you didn't sleep, that you stayed with him the whole time. "She helped," Elena said. "She was up all night too." "I know," he said. "She told me." He paused. "She also told me what you said to her, about understanding why she'd been difficult." Elena picked up a biscuit and ate a bite of it because if she didn't eat something, she was going to fall asleep sitting up. "I meant it," she said. "I know you did," he said. I think that's why it worked." She looked at him. He was exhausted too. 4 hours hard riding each way, no sleep. And he had the raw, scoured look of someone who had spent the night afraid and was now standing in the aftermath of the fear. He was not a man who let things show easily. She was learning. But right now the things were showing. "Eli's going to be fine," she said. "Yes," he said, "because you were there." "Because I was paying attention," she said. "Those are different things." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I sent a message to someone in Crestfall, someone I trust, about Harlan." She put the biscuit down. "I want to know who he met in town," Wade said. "Before I confront him, I want to be sure." "That's right," she said. "It's going to take a few days." "I know." "In the meantime," he said, "I want you to keep going through the accounts. All of them. Not just the household ledger, the full ranch records. Everything Harlan had access to." She looked at him steadily. "You understand that what we're likely to find is going to be worse than what I've already found?" "Yes," he said. "I've known for a while that something was wrong. I just didn't know." He stopped. "I didn't let myself look at it directly. I think because I didn't want to believe it was deliberate." "It's easier to think it's just bad luck," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She picked up the biscuit again and ate the rest of it. and he sat across from her while the kitchen settled around them. The sound of the fire, the distant sounds of cattle, the particular quiet of a house where a child was finally sleeping deeply after a fever has passed its peak. "Harlan comes in from the east pasture around 4, she said. "I'll be in the office until then." "All right," he said. She stood up, picked up the plate, and carried it to the basin. "Elena," he said. She stopped. "What you said last night, about your father's farm." His voice was careful. "I'm sorry that happened to you." She stood at the basin for a moment. The cold water was on her hands. Outside the kitchen window, the sky was the flat, pale gray of a winter afternoon working up to something. "I'm not," she said. "Not entirely, because if none of it had happened, I wouldn't be here, and I think I'm supposed to be here." She didn't look at him when she said it. She wasn't sure she could have said it if she'd been looking at him. But she heard him, a moment later, push his chair back from the table. And she heard him say quietly, "I think so too." And she stood at the basin with the cold water and thought about $900 in fraudulent ledger entries, and a man named Thornton who had stood at the edge of an auction yard and made a decision. And she thought about the 14 months of careful, patient bleeding that someone had been conducting on this ranch. Steady enough to wound it slowly, not enough to kill it quickly, designed to bring a desperate man to his knees over time. She thought about what kind of man thinks that way, what kind of patience that required, what kind of certainty that no one would catch it. Samuel Thornton had seen her standing on that platform. He had made his assessment and he had walked away. She thought, that was his first mistake. She turned off the water and dried her hands and went back to the office, and she opened the ranch records, the full set, the ones she hadn't touched yet, and she sat down in the chair and turned to the first page and began to read. The full ranch records took her 4 days to read properly. Not because they were long, though they were long, but because she had learned from the household ledger that speed was the enemy of this particular kind of looking. Whoever had been doing this was not careless. They had relied on the assumption that no one would sit down and read every page with the patient attention of someone who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from finding the truth. They had been right until now. She read in the mornings before anyone else was up, by lamplight, with a cup of coffee that she refilled twice and a piece of paper that accumulated notations in her small, precise handwriting. She read in the afternoons when the twins were occupied and the ranch hands were working, and the house had the particular quiet of a place operating at its normal rhythm. She read with the ledger in her lap in the evenings, after supper, when Wade sat across the office from her going through his own correspondence, and neither of them spoke much, but the silence had become the kind that doesn't need filling. By the 4th day, she had a picture. It was worse than she had thought. The fraudulent supply payments were only the surface layer, the part that Harlan had apparently decided was safe because it was modest enough to pass as administrative slippage. Underneath that were 3 separate entries involving fence maintenance contracts paid to companies she couldn't find any record of in Crestfall or the surrounding towns. There was a transaction from 11 months ago recorded as an equipment lease payment to a company called Ridgeline Implement, and when she cross-referenced it against the actual equipment inventory she had compiled from her conversations with Lou and Dex, there was no equipment on the property that corresponded to the lease. Someone had paid $340 to lease something that was never delivered. And then there was the cattle record. She almost missed it because it was buried in the livestock management section, which was voluminous and technical and clearly designed, she thought now, to be tedious enough that no one with authority over the accounts would ever want to read it carefully. But she read it carefully, and what she found was a discrepancy in the cattle count that had begun appearing 14 months ago, exactly when the other fraudulent entries had begun, and had been corrected each quarter, on paper, with a notation that read, "Natural attrition and seasonal adjustment," in handwriting that was not Wade's. The numbers, if she was reading them correctly, suggested that somewhere between 60 and 80 head of cattle had been moved off Mercer land over the past 14 months and never accounted for in revenue. At current market prices, 60 head of cattle was worth more than the ranch brought in from legitimate sales in an average quarter. She sat with that number for a long time. Then she got up, walked to the barn where Wade was examining the shoe situation on the same horse he'd been worrying about a week ago, and said without preamble, "We need to do a cattle count." He looked up from the hoof he was holding. "What did you find?" She told him. His face went through the same sequence she had seen in the office the week before, the absorbing, the compressing, the deliberate steadying. But this time the steadying took longer. He set the horse's hoof down carefully, straightened up, and said, "When?" "Tomorrow morning, before Harlan gets in," she said. "Oh." The Count took most of the morning. She went with Wade and Lou and Dex, working section by section across the pastures in the cold early light, tallying cattle with the focused patience of someone who understood that precision mattered more than speed. Lou didn't ask why they were doing this. He had a good face for a man who had his own suspicions, a face that had learned to wait without pressing. The final number, when they finished, was 63 head short of the official record. They stood in the east pasture, the four of them, in a row, looking at the grass. The cold was significant by then. Dex's breath was coming in visible clouds. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Lou said quietly, "I wondered." Wade looked at him. "I wondered," Lou said again. "About 8 months back, I thought the east herd was thin. I mentioned it to Harlan, and he said there'd been a sickness, that he'd had to put some down before I'd come on that week. I let it go." "Why?" Wade asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. Lou looked at the ground. "Because he'd been here 8 years and I hadn't, because I didn't want to be the new man calling the foreman a liar." He paused. "That was wrong of me." "You didn't know what you were looking at," Elena said. "He was counting on that." Lou looked at her. He had been looking at her differently since the night of Eli's fever. Word traveled fast in a small operation, and everyone on the ranch knew by the next morning what had happened. The look wasn't sentimentality. Lou was not a sentimental man. It was the look of someone recalibrating an assessment. "You're right," he said, "but I still should have pushed harder." "Yes," she said. "But you didn't know then. You know now." Wade said, "The message I sent to Crestfall, I got a reply 2 days ago." She looked at him. He hadn't mentioned this. Harlan met with a man named Cleet, Thomas Cleet. He paused. "Cleet is Samuel Thornton's foreman." The east pasture went quiet around them. Even the cattle's sounds seemed to recede. "So it's confirmed," she said. "It's confirmed," Wade said. Lou's expression had gone flat and hard. The expression of a man who had just had something he suspected turned into something he knew and didn't like what knowing it felt like. "What do you want to do?" he said. Wade looked at Elena. She recognized the look. Not indecision, but the particular acknowledgement of a man who understood that the person across from him had been thinking about this longer and more systematically than he had. "We can't confront Harlan yet," she said. "Not until we have everything documented in a form that can't be disputed. The ledger entries, the cattle count, the payment records, written, organized, signed, and dated." She paused. "And we need to know the full extent of it. If we confront him now and we've only found part of what he's done, he'll know exactly where to put the holes in our case." "How long?" Wade said. "A week," she said. "Maybe 10 days. And in the meantime, Harlan keeps working here, keeps having access." "Yes," she said, "which is also why we need to be careful about how we do this next part." She told them the rest of it then, the outline of what she had been constructing in the back of her mind for the past 4 days, between reading and cooking and sitting with Eli, while he finished recovering and watching Mara move through the house with her defenses incrementally and grudgingly and almost imperceptibly lowering. It was not a perfect plan, she said that plainly. It had gaps and dependencies and points where it could fail. But it was the plan that was available to them with what they had. And in her experience, limited experience, she was 18 years old and had never done anything like this. You worked with what you had. Lou nodded as she talked, not enthusiastically, not with the energy of a man inspired, with the steady, level acknowledgement of someone who has heard a workable plan and recognizes it as such. Dex said, "If Harlan figures out we're on to him, he already suspects something," Elena said. "He saw me in the office last week. He knows I've been in the accounts." She thought of the way Harlan had looked at her in the kitchen doorway, the too-controlled expression. "He hasn't moved yet because he's not sure how much I found. He'll be cautious for a little while. We have to use that time." The winter arrived without much warning, the way winter did on this side of the mountains. Not gradually, but as a decision, a hard shift from cold but manageable to something with actual intention to it. She woke on a Saturday morning to find 3 inches of snow on the ground and more coming, and the temperature had dropped enough overnight that the water in the basin in her room had a thin skim of ice on it. She dressed in everything she owned, which was not enough. This was a practical problem she added to the list of practical problems she was maintaining in a separate section of her notes, under the heading Immediate Needs, which had grown to include: her winter coat was inadequate for this altitude, her boots were not waterproofed, and the crack in her bedroom window frame needed to be stuffed with something better than the rag she'd jammed in it the first week. She mentioned none of this to anyone. It wasn't the moment. The snow complicated the ranch operations in the way that snow always complicates things, which is to say, it made everything that was already difficult considerably more so. The cattle needed more attention, the water troughs froze overnight and required breaking twice a day. The east pasture fence had a section that Lou had mentioned needed work, and the snow revealed it in dramatic fashion when 12 head pushed through it into territory that wasn't Mercer land and had to be retrieved in conditions that were miserable for everyone involved, including the cattle. Harlan supervised the fence repair. Elena watched him from the house and tried to read the way he moved, the way he spoke to the hands. He was good at his job. She could see that clearly, and she wasn't going to pretend she couldn't. I was efficient and authoritative, and the hands responded to him with the ease of long practice. He was also, she now understood, systematically stealing from the man who had trusted him for 8 years. Those two things existed simultaneously in the same person, and she had been young enough when she started this that she had expected to find it harder to hold them both in mind at once. She didn't. It was one of the things her father's life had taught her, that people were frequently capable of being genuinely good at one thing while being genuinely rotten in another direction. And the mistake was to let the first thing make you blind to the second. She documented everything. Every day she added to the record she was compiling, expanding the notes, cross-referencing the entries, building a picture that was organized and sequential and would make sense to someone who had not been sitting in this ranch for 3 weeks learning its shape. She was building it for someone who would look at it cold, with no context, and need to understand it immediately. She was building it for a judge, or a lawman, or whoever it was going to take to make this stick. On the 8th day, 2 things happened. The first was that she found the insurance record. She had not been looking for it specifically. She had been working through a section of the records relating to a water rights dispute from several years back, something Wade had mentioned in passing, a neighbor who had tried to claim access to the creek that ran through the south edge of Mercer land, when she found, tucked between 2 pages of that dispute's correspondence, a handwritten note that was not related to the water rights at all. It was a note about a fire. The wording was careful in the way of something written by someone who knew how to be careful. It referenced a planned event in the eastern structure and a claim filing, and a figure, $4,000, in a context that made it clear this was the expected payout. It was dated 8 months ago. It was not signed. Her hand stilled on the page. The eastern structure, she thought about that. There was only one substantial eastern structure on Mercer land, the old hay barn on the far east boundary, the one that had burned down 6 months ago. Wade had mentioned it briefly in the context of the ranch's troubles. A fire, he'd said. Nobody hurt, but the barn was a complete loss. He'd thought it was a lantern left burning. He had filed an insurance claim. She knew that because she had the claim paperwork in her records. He had been paid $3,000. Somebody had been planning on 4. She sat with the note for a long time. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. She thought they should be shaking, given what she was looking at, given that she had just found evidence not of fraud, but of something significantly more serious than fraud: the deliberate destruction of property, the staging of a false insurance claim. She took out a fresh piece of paper and copied the note exactly, word for word, in her own handwriting, noting at the top the location where she had found it and the date. She put the original back where she had found it. She folded her copy and put it in her coat pocket. Then she went to find Wade. She found him on the porch. He was standing there in the cold with no particular purpose that she could see, just standing there looking at the snow and the mountains with the expression of a man who needed a few minutes outside of everything. She understood that. She had those minutes herself sometimes, standing at the kitchen window early in the morning before the day started, just looking at the same horizon. She stood beside him for a moment without speaking. The cold was clean and total. The ranch spread out below the porch in its winter state, the white of the snow, the dark of the outbuilding roofs, the thin line of smoke from the bunkhouse. It was, she thought, Despite everything, a beautiful piece of land. She could understand why someone would want it badly enough to spend years taking it apart from the inside. "I found something," she said. He looked at her. She showed him the copied note. She watched him read it. She watched his face move through things she couldn't name, a sequence of realizations, each one landing and rearranging what came before it. When he finished, he lowered the paper and looked out at the ranch for a long moment. "The barn fire," he said. "Yes. I thought it was an accident." "I know," she said. "That was the point." His jaw was set very hard. She could see the muscle in it working. "Thornton," he said. "Or someone working for Thornton," she said. "The note isn't signed, but the timing is consistent with everything else." He said nothing for a long while. The cold moved around them. Below, she could see decks coming out of the main barn, crossing the yard toward the water troughs. "This is bigger than I thought," Wade said. It wasn't self-pity. It was a recalibration, the same thing she had done herself when the cattle numbers had finished resolving in her head. "This isn't just Harlan skimming from the accounts. This has been a—" He stopped, started again. "He's been trying to take the ranch." "Yes," she said, methodically, over a long time. "My guess is the goal was to get you into a position where you couldn't make the land payments, the water rights, the property taxes, whatever was most exposed, and then move in when you were desperate enough to sell." "Or desperate enough to take whatever was offered," Wade said. "Yes." He turned the copied note over in his hands. "The original is still in the records?" "Where I found it," she said. "I didn't want to move it." He nodded. "Good." He was quiet for another moment. Then, "What do we need?" "Everything I have, organized and signed," she said. "A witness who can confirm the cattle count. Lou, ideally. He's been here long enough to have relevant history, and he's credible." She paused. "And we need someone in authority. A county sheriff, a land officer, someone with jurisdiction over insurance fraud." "The county seat is in Hardale," he said. 3 days' ride." "I know." She had looked at the maps in the office. "But I don't think we should send a letter. I think someone needs to go in person and present this." He looked at her. "You think I should go?" "I think one of us needs to," she said. "And I think I need to stay here." "Why?" "Because if Harlan figures out that the documentation is being taken somewhere," she said, "he'll move, and someone needs to be here to watch what he does when he moves." Wade looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression that she had started to recognize over the past 2 weeks. A particular quality of attention, not the assessing look of the auction, not the surprised recalibration of that first breakfast. Something quieter, something that she didn't quite have a name for yet. "You'd be here alone," he said, "with the children, with Harlan on the property." "Harlan isn't going to do anything obvious," she said. "He's too careful. That's his whole method. Careful, gradual, nothing that looks like what it is." "He burned down a barn," Wade said. 8 months ago, when he needed a specific outcome," she said. "Right now, he's still in a position where he doesn't know how much we know. He's cautious. But if he figures it out, then I'll deal with it," she said. She said it plainly, without bravado, because she didn't have bravado. She had the specific kind of confidence that comes from having been afraid many times and having found out, each time, that you were more functional in crisis than you expected. She was not pretending she wasn't scared. She was just making the decision anyway. Wade held her gaze. "All right," he said. "I'll leave tomorrow morning." Well, the second thing that happened on the 8th day was Mara. It was evening after supper, and Elena was in the office adding to her documentation, and Mara appeared in the doorway. She did this sometimes now. Appeared, stood for a moment, left. Like she was testing whether the doorway would hold before she committed to the room. Elena had learned to let her do it at her own pace. This time, Mara came in. She sat down in the chair across the desk, the chair where Wade usually sat when they went through the records together, and she folded her hands in her lap and said, "I know something's wrong." Elena looked up from her notes. "I'm 12, Mara said. "Not stupid." "I know," Elena said. "Who told you to come in here?" "Nobody," Mara said. "I noticed that you've been in here every day, and that you and my father keep stopping talking when we come in the room, and that Lou looks different when he looks at Harlan now." She paused. "And I heard you on the porch. Not what you said, but that it was serious." Elena set down her pencil. How much of it did you actually hear? Mara met her gaze directly. Enough that I know my father is leaving tomorrow and you're staying here with us, and that has something to do with Harlan. Elena looked at her for a moment. Then she said, Your father will tell you what he wants you to know when he's ready. I'm not going to get ahead of that. But there is something. There's something, Elena confirmed. And we're handling it. That's what I can tell you. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Is it dangerous? Elena thought about the barn fire, about Harlan's face in the kitchen doorway, about the note she had found between the water rights correspondents. Not right now, she said. Right now it's careful and slow. That's the kind of work we're doing. Mara looked at the papers on the desk. That's what all of this is? What you've been doing in here? Yes? Mara nodded slowly. She looked at the papers with an expression that was trying to be neutral and was not quite succeeding. There was something underneath it, something that looked at this specific angle in this specific lamplight, like a girl deciding something. I can keep Eli busy, she said finally, if you need time in here without him asking questions. He asks a lot of questions. Elena looked at her. I know he does. I can manage him, Mara said. I've been managing him for 4 years. I know you have, Elena said. And then, because Mara was 12 and had been managing her brother for 4 years while her father grieved and the ranch fell apart around them, and because she deserved to hear it, you've done a very good job. Mara's expression did something complicated. She hadn't been expecting that, and it landed somewhere tender, somewhere not fully defended. She pulled it back fast. The defense came up again almost immediately. But Elena had seen it. The flash of a child who had been competent and capable and responsible for a very long time and had almost forgotten what it felt like to be recognized for it. Okay, Mara said, with her composed face. So you'll let me help? I'll let you help, Elena said. Mara stood up, squared her shoulders, and left the room with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been given a job and was already planning how to do it. Elena looked at the empty doorway for a moment. Then she turned back to her notes and kept working. Wade left before dawn. She walked with him to the barn while the stars were still up, carrying the oil lamp, and she gave him the full documentation, the originals, the copies, the organized sequence of evidence starting from the fraudulent supply entries and ending with the barn fire note, all of it in a leather folder she had borrowed from the office shelf. He tucked it inside his coat. The sheriff's name in Hardale is Greer, she said. I don't know him, but Lou does. Lou said he's straight. All right. Don't go to anyone else first, she said. Not a lawyer, not a land office clerk, nobody who might have a connection to Thornton. Go directly to Greer. He looked at her. You've thought about this. I think about most things too much, she said. It's a habit. The horse was already saddled. She had heard him in the barn earlier before she'd gotten up and had guessed correctly. He took the reins and turned to her, and for a moment they stood in the pre-dawn dark with the lamp between them making their shadows fall long in opposite directions. 3 days to Hardale, he said. 2 days there, maybe 3, depending on how Greer moves. 3 days back. I know, she said. Go. He went. She stood in the barn doorway and listened to the hoofbeats until they faded into the dark. And then the ranch was very quiet. Just the horses in their stalls, the cold, the distant cattle, the sound of wind around the barn's upper edges. She went back inside. For 3 days, nothing happened. Harlan came in from the east pasture on schedule, worked through his tasks without visible change in behavior, and was cordial to Elena in the way he always was. The careful, surface-level cordiality of a man who was not going to show his hand. She returned it in kind. They were two people playing two different versions of the same game, and both knew it and neither acknowledged it. Lou watched. Dex and Cobb and Reel worked. Mara kept Eli occupied with a project she had invented that involved cataloging the books in the house's small library. Not a natural activity for Eli, who had the restless energy of a 12-year-old boy who'd been mostly indoors recovering from illness. But Mara managed it with the efficient authority of someone who had been managing him for years. Elena continued building her documentation, now focusing on establishing clear timelines for each piece of evidence, so that when Greer, if Greer, came to the ranch, he could understand the sequence of events without her having to reconstruct it verbally. She wrote it as if she would not be there to explain it herself. That was the discipline of it. That was how you made something real. On the fourth day, Harlan didn't come in from the east pasture. Lou noticed at noon and mentioned it to Elena without inflection, in the quiet of the kitchen where Mara was in the next room and Eli was allegedly still cataloging books. He left early, Lou said, before the rest of the hands, took his horse out the east gate. Did he take anything? Elena said. His saddlebags, Lou said. Full ones. She thought about that. Full saddlebags through the east gate meant he was going toward Thornton's land, not toward town. The east gate was not the route to anywhere except Thornton's spread, which shared the eastern boundary with Mercer land for about 3 miles. He knows, she thought, or he suspects enough that he's not waiting any longer. She thought about the barn, 8 months ago, before Thornton had a reason to be careful. Lou, she said, I need you to sleep in the main barn tonight, not the bunkhouse. He looked at her steadily. You think he's coming back? I think I don't know what he's going to do, she said, and I'd rather have someone watching the barn. Lou thought for a moment, then, I'll bring Dex. Yes, she said. Good. She spent the afternoon moving this documentation, the originals, the organized folder she had prepared for Wade, everything, out of the office and into a location she spent 40 minutes selecting before she was satisfied with it. She was not going to leave the evidence in the most obvious place in the house. She told Mara that evening, quietly, in the kitchen after supper, while Eli was washing dishes with the focused attention of someone still slightly annoyed about the book cataloging project, that she needed Mara to do one thing if anything unusual happened in the night. Stay in your room, she said. Keep Eli in his room. No matter what sounds you hear. Can you do that? Mara's face was very still. Yes, she said. What sounds? I don't know, Elena said honestly. I'm hoping none, but I need you to be someone I can count on if I'm wrong. Mara held her gaze for a long moment. 12 years old, with her mother 4 years in the ground, and her brother barely recovered from illness and her father 3 days away. You can count on me, she said. I know I can, Elena said. The night came down cold and clear. Elena sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low and a cup of coffee that she didn't particularly want and her ear on the silence of the ranch. Lou and Dex were in the main barn. Cobb and Reel were in the bunkhouse. She had said nothing to them specifically, not wanting to create alarm that Harlan might sense if he came back. The children were upstairs. She sat and waited. 2 hours after midnight, she heard hoofbeats. Not from the east gate, which was what she had been expecting. From the road. The main road. From the direction of town. She stood up and went to the kitchen window and looked out into the dark and saw, in the pale moonlight on the snow, 2 horses coming up the ranch road. 2 riders. Not Harlan. She went to the front door and opened it, letting the cold in, and stood on the porch with the lamp and waited. The first rider came into the lamp's reach and she saw, under the coat, the star on his chest. The second rider was Wade. He had made it to Hardale in 2.5 days, not 3. He had apparently not stopped for much of anything on the way back. He pulled the horse up at the porch and looked at her standing there in the cold with the lamp and said, Is everything all right? Harlan's gone, she said. He left this morning with full saddlebags through the east gate. He went toward Thornton's land. Wade looked at the man beside him. The man with the star, Greer, she assumed, was in his 50s, square-built, with the weathered face of someone who had been making long rides in bad weather for many years. He took in what she had just said with the particular unflustered quality of someone who had learned that situations usually provided you with whatever complication was most inconvenient, and that getting exercised about it didn't help. Miss Voss, Wade said, this is Sheriff Greer. I have the documentation inside, she said. Come in. She stood aside and let them in, and the cold followed them and the door closed, and in the kitchen she put more wood on the fire and set water on to boil for coffee, and then she went to the location she had chosen that afternoon and retrieved the folder. She set it on the kitchen table in front of Greer and said, Everything is organized by date and category. The cattle count discrepancy starts on page 4. The insurance note is at the end, with my written account of where and how I found it. Greer looked at the folder, then at her. How old are you? He said. 18, she said. He opened the folder. He read for a long time. She poured 3 cups of coffee and set them on the table. Wade sat across from her, and they didn't speak while Greer read, and the fire worked on the cold, and the ranch was quiet around them except for the wind. When Greer finished, he set the folder down and sat back. "Where did you say the original note was?" he said. "In the records box in the office," she said. "Exactly where I found it. I put a piece of paper marking the page." "I'll need to see it." "Of course," she said. He looked at the folder again. Then he looked at her again. She could feel the assessment in it. Not hostile, but thorough, the look of a man who was deciding whether to trust what he was holding. She met it without flinching, because she had built what was in that folder carefully enough that it didn't need her to sell it. It spoke for itself. "This is well done," Greer said finally. Flat, matter of fact. Not a compliment so much as a professional observation. "It's accurate," she said. "That's the point." Greer nodded once. He picked up the coffee. "All right," he said. "Let's start at the beginning." Outside, the snow lay quiet on the ranch and the mountains, and somewhere through the east fence, on land that bordered Thornton's, Harlan Pike was either running or reporting back to the man who had sent him. And Samuel Thornton, 3 days' ride from where he had stood at an auction watching the Voss girl on a platform and deciding she was nothing to worry about, did not yet know that his plan had already been read, documented, organized, and handed to the one person in the county with the authority to end it. But he was going to find out. And when he did, Elena Voss would be ready. Sheriff Greer stayed 3 days. He was not a dramatic man, which Elena appreciated. He did not make speeches or announcements. He moved through the ranch with the quiet, methodical efficiency of someone who had been doing this work for a long time and had learned that the work itself was the thing, not the performance of it. He examined the original barn fire note in the office records box exactly where she had marked it. He went through the ledgers himself, cross-referencing her documentation against the originals, with the careful attention of someone who was building something that needed to hold up in a court. He interviewed Lou, who answered every question directly and without embellishment, in the flat, undecorated language of a man who understood that what he said was going to matter later, and chose his words accordingly. He interviewed Elena last, on the morning of his second day, sitting across the kitchen table from her with a deputy she hadn't been introduced to, who took notes on a small pad of paper. He asked her to walk him through the sequence, from the day she arrived to the day she found the Pemberton entries to the barn fire note to the cattle count. She did it without notes, because she had been over it enough times in her head that the sequence was solid. She told it plainly, in order, without interpretation, just what she had found, where, and when. She did not characterize Harlan Pike or Samuel Thornton or suggest conclusions. She let the sequence speak. When she finished, Greer sat for a moment. His deputy kept writing. The fire in the stove made its sounds. "How long had you been on the ranch when you found the first fraudulent entry?" Greer asked. 3 days, she said. A pause. "You came in as a labor contract," he said. It was not a question exactly, more like a man verifying something he still found slightly difficult to credit. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than he had looked at anything else during the interview. Then he moved on to his next question, and she answered it, and the deputy kept writing. Harlan Pike was located on the 3rd morning. She didn't know the details of how Greer managed it. He was not forthcoming with details unless they were directly relevant. But she gathered from the conversation she overheard between Greer and his deputy that Harlan had not in fact gone to Thornton's property. He had gone through it and kept going toward the territorial line, which suggested he had known the situation was compromised and had decided that distance was the most useful response. I was found at a way station 2 days east of the territorial border, which was apparently not far enough. Greer's deputy brought him back on the 3rd afternoon. Elena watched from the kitchen window. Mara was beside her, not asking to be there, just present, standing close enough that their arms were almost touching, as Harlan Pike came up the ranch road with his hands in front of him and a deputy on each side. He looked smaller than she remembered. People often did, she had noticed, when the context changed around them. He didn't look toward the house. He looked straight ahead, with the fixed forward gaze of someone who has made the decision that acknowledgement is worse than nothing. Mara said quietly, "Did he really do all of it?" "Yes," Elena said. "For how long?" "At least 14 months that I can document," Elena said. "Possibly longer." Mara was quiet for a moment. "He used to fix Eli's kite," she said, 2 summers ago. The string broke and Eli couldn't figure out how to reattach it, and Harlan spent an hour on it. Elena didn't say anything. She waited. I know that doesn't mean anything, Mara said. I keep thinking about it. It means he was a person, Elena said, not just a scheme. It's harder when they're a person. Mara looked at her. Does it get easier? Some things do, Elena said. That particular one, I'm not sure. Well, Greer left the following morning, taking Harlan Pike and his deputy and the copies of Elena's documentation that she had prepared specifically for the Hardale County Court. He left the originals at the ranch. Wade had a strongbox in the office, which Elena had found on her second day and mentioned to no one, and that was where the originals went now, with the key on a cord around Wade's neck. Before Greer mounted up, he stood in the yard with Wade for a moment. Elena was on the porch and could hear most of it. Pike will cooperate, Greer said. He knows what he's looking at if he doesn't. The documentation you're... He paused, and she understood the pause, the slight difficulty of categorizing her. Miss Voss compiled is thorough enough that there isn't much he can do except confirm the sequence and name his employer. Thornton, Wade said. That's what the evidence suggests, Greer said carefully. What Pike confirms is what will determine what happens next with Thornton specifically. How long? Wade said. These things move at their own pace, Greer said, which was not an answer but was also not nothing. I'll send word. He rode out. Wade stood in the yard watching the road for a moment after the hoofbeats faded. Then he turned and looked at Elena on the porch, and she looked back at him, and the silence between them was the kind that has too much in it to be filled with words right away. She went back inside to start breakfast. The shift in the ranch's atmosphere after Greer's departure was something she felt more than saw. It was not relief exactly. Relief would have been premature, and she was not a person who allowed herself premature reactions. It was more like the particular quality of air after a storm has passed, and before you have fully assessed the damage, when the worst is over but the accounting has not yet begun. The hands felt it too. Lou, who had been operating under the same careful tension she had, visibly settled. Not relaxed, but settled. The difference between a man braced for impact and a man who has processed that the impact has happened and he's still standing. Dex had more to say at meals. Cobb and Reel, who had not been told the full extent of what Harlan had done, but were not unintelligent men and had figured out most of the shape of it, worked with a focused energy that felt like something had been released. The twins moved through the change differently, the way twins often move through things differently, even when they're close. Eli, who had been given a simplified version of events by Wade, fraud, theft, a bad man, everything will be okay, processed it with the straightforward emotional efficiency of a 12-year-old boy who had other things on his mind, primarily whether the east pasture fence was repaired sufficiently to withstand the next snowfall, and whether Elena would teach him to make cornbread himself. She said yes to the cornbread. It was a surprisingly quick study in the kitchen, better than she expected, and the lesson became a morning ritual over the following week. Elena talking him through it, Eli doing it wrong in small ways and then correcting, both of them standing at the stove in the cold kitchen with flour on their hands, and the particular companionable quiet of people doing something together that requires enough focus to make conversation optional. Mara was quieter, not the hostile quiet of her first weeks. That quality had been draining out of it steadily since the night of Eli's fever, but a thoughtful quiet, the quiet of a girl doing a lot of internal processing that she wasn't ready to articulate. She watched Elena more than she spoke to her. Elena let her watch. She had learned that Mara's watching was its own form of relationship building. The girl was assembling something, and pushing her would only slow the assembly. It was on a Thursday, 10 days after Greer's departure, that Mara finally said the thing she had apparently been building toward. They were in the kitchen after supper. Eli had gone out to the barn to check on a colt he had been monitoring with the obsessive attention of a child who has adopted a project. Wade was in the office. Elena was washing dishes and Mara was drying them, which had become their routine without either of them formally establishing it. Mara said without looking up from the plate she was drying, "Are you going to stay? After the contract?" Elena's hand stilled in the basin. She had not been expecting the question at this specific moment, though she had known it was coming at some point. "I don't know," she said honestly. Mara dried the plate, set it down, picked up another one. "The contract is 2 years," she said. "That's what my father said." "Yes." "So you'd have to decide after 2 years." "Yes." Mara was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to stay?" Elena thought about how to answer this. She thought about the crack in the bedroom window frame, which Wade had finally gotten around to filling properly last week. She thought about the kitchen in the mornings, the way the light came through at a certain angle when the snow was on the ground outside, and hit the far wall with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. She thought about Eli's flour-covered hands, and Mara's watching, and Lou's plain, reliable competence, and the way Wade looked at her sometimes with that thing she still didn't have a name for. "I think I might," she said, "but it's complicated." "Because of the contract?" Mara said. "Because contracts can change. My father could—" "Not because of the contract," Elena said. Mara dried another plate. Elena could feel her thinking, the particular quality of Mara's thinking, which had its own texture. "Because of what people would say," Mara said, "about how you got here." Elena looked at her. "Partly." "People already say things," Mara said, "about us, about my father, after my mother died, about the ranch." She paused. "People say things about everything. That doesn't change what's true." Elena looked at the girl standing beside her with a damp dish towel in her hands and thought, "She's 12 years old, and she's right, and she knows she's right, and she's saying it to me because she wants me to hear it." "No," Elena said. "It doesn't." Mara set down the last plate. She folded the dish towel and put it over the rack the way Elena had shown her in the first week. Then she said, without drama, without sentiment, in the plain way of someone stating a fact they have checked and are now reporting, "I want you to stay." Elena stood at the basin with the cold water and the sound of the fire and the distant sound of Eli in the barn, talking to the colt in the one-sided, earnest way he talked to animals. "Thank you, Mara," she said. Mara nodded once, the precise economy of a girl who had said what she came to say and didn't need to add anything to it, and went upstairs. The word from Hardale came on a Monday, 3 weeks after Greer's departure. It came as a letter, delivered by a writer who was clearly cold and wanted coffee, and got it, sitting at the kitchen table while Wade read the letter at his desk and Elena waited in the doorway. He read it twice. She watched his face. "Pike gave them everything," he said, named Thornton specifically, named Cleet, gave them the dates of the meetings, the arrangement, the whole of it. He looked up. "Thornton was served papers this morning. The Hardale County prosecutor is taking up the fraud case, the arson, the insurance scheme," he paused, "and the cattle theft." "The cattle," she said. "Were any of them recovered?" 42 head, he said. "Apparently Thornton had them on his east pasture under a rebranding scheme. Greer says the brand evidence is clear." 42 head. She did the math in her head automatically. Market price, current season, what that represented against the losses she had documented. It was not everything. It was a meaningful portion of it. "What about Thornton's land purchases?" she said. "The ones I flagged in the correspondence files, the properties he's acquired in the valley over the past 3 years." Wade set down the letter. "Greer says that's a separate matter, potentially. They're looking at whether some of those were obtained through similar methods, fraudulent pressure on other ranchers." She had expected that. Other ranchers meant other people in the valley who might have stories like this one, who had watched their operations deteriorate without understanding why. She had written that possibility in the margin of her notes 3 weeks ago and underlined it. "He wants you to testify," Wade said, "in Hardale, when the case comes to trial." She looked at him. "When?" "A few months, probably. Greer says they're building the case and moving faster than usual because the documentation is," he looked at the letter again, "unusually comprehensive and well-organized." That's a quote. She absorbed that. Testifying in Hardale, sitting in a room and saying publicly what she had found and how she had found it, being seen by a court and a county as the person who had done this. She was not sure how she felt about that. "I'll do it," she said. "I know you will," Wade said. "I never doubted it, but..." February brought the hardest cold of the season, the kind that tested every weak point in every structure on the ranch, and found most of them. The water troughs froze solidly despite their breaking twice a day. One of the outbuilding roofs came close to failing under the snow load and required an emergency repair that took 3 days and the full effort of every hand on the property, plus Wade. The cattle needed supplementary feed, and the feed stores, while not dangerously low, were lower than Elena would have wanted by the time March began to show itself on the horizon. She managed the household through it with the same patient, methodical attention she had applied to the ledgers. She did not do it perfectly. There was a week in the middle of February where she miscalculated the flour stores and they ran short at a bad time, and she had to manage the kitchen on reduced stock for 4 days while waiting for the weather to clear enough for a supply run. She was not graceful about the mistake. She sat with it, figured out what she'd missed in the calculation, and adjusted the method for next time. Eli noticed the bread was different during those 4 days and said so, directly, with the blunt candor of a 12-year-old who had not yet learned that sometimes you don't mention things. "The bread is smaller," he said. "I know," she said. "Why?" "Because I made a mistake with the supply order," she said. He looked at her. He had the expression of a child confronted with an adult admitting error, which was apparently unusual enough to require a moment of processing. "Oh," he said. Then, "Will it be normal again soon?" "When the weather clears," she said. "Okay," he said, and went back to his meal, which was the most uncomplicated response he could have had, and she appreciated it more than he would ever know. Wade said nothing about the bread. When the supply run finally happened and the flour was back and the bread was normal again, he said, at supper, that it was good, which was what he always said when she cooked something that worked. She was learning to read the calibration of his compliments, that good from Wade Mercer meant something specific and was not thrown around, and that the reliability of it was more meaningful than its simplicity suggested. They were building something, she understood. Not quickly, not smoothly, not without complications that neither of them had fully addressed yet, but building it. The first person from outside the ranch to say something directly to Elena about what she had done was a woman named Margaret Selby, who ran the dry goods store in the nearest town with her husband and had apparently been watching the Mercer situation from a distance for several years. Elena was in town on a supply run in early March, her first time in town since arriving at the ranch, which she noted with some private awareness. When Margaret Selby appeared beside her at the counter while she was placing her order and said, in a voice that was quietly but firmly pitched to be heard by anyone in the vicinity, "I heard what you did about the Thornton business." Elena looked at her. Margaret Selby was a woman in her 50s with the kind of face that had been pretty once and had moved into something better. More character, more certainty. She was looking at Elena with an expression of direct and uncomplicated respect. "Word travels," Elena said. "In this valley it travels at approximately the speed of sound," Margaret said. "What you put together with the ledgers and the cattle records and the rest of it, my husband has known something was wrong on the Mercer Ranch for a year. He couldn't have told you what or why. He just knew. And then you come in there and in 3 weeks, you've got a case ready for the county sheriff." Elena didn't know what to say to that. She said, "It was in the numbers. I just read them." Margaret said, in the tone of someone who is being polite about a modest deflection. "Well, you let me know if you need anything, from the store or otherwise." She paused. "And tell Mr. Mercer we're glad the ranch is going to be all right." She moved away before Elena could respond. Elena stood at the counter for a moment. The store owner, Margaret's husband, a quiet man named Ed Selby, was writing up her order without comment, but she could see that he had heard, and that he agreed with his wife's assessment, and that his agreement was the kind that had come from long thought. She picked up her order and went back to the wagon and sat in it for a moment before starting for the ranch. The main street moved around her. The ordinary business of a small frontier town, the sounds and faces and carts and horses that constituted daily life in a place like this. She had stood in this county's auction yard 3 months ago on a platform while people assessed her worth in dollars. She sat in the wagon and thought about that, and then she thought about the dry goods order in the back and the bread she would make with the flour and the bread that Eli was now capable of making himself on a good day. And she picked up the reins and turned the wagon toward home. Samuel Thornton came to Mercer Ranch on a Wednesday in late March. She was not expecting him. Nobody was. He came alone, which was the first thing that surprised her. A man like Thornton, in the position he was currently in, arriving alone at the ranch he had spent 14 months trying to dismantle, with no foreman and no legal representative visible, just himself on a good horse on a clear March morning. She saw him from the kitchen window first. She stood very still and watched him come up the road, and then she went to the front door and opened it and stood on the porch. He was older than she had thought at the auction. Up close, or close enough. He had the weathered, substantial look of a man who had been powerful for a long time and had not yet fully absorbed what it meant that things had changed. He pulled his horse up at the base of the porch steps and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not hostile, not conciliatory, not the smirk she had seen in the auction yard. Something more considered than any of those. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Thornton," she said. "Mercer here?" "He's in the barn," she said. "I'll get him." She didn't move. "What do you want?" He looked at her for a moment. "I want to talk to Wade Mercer." "About what?" she said. The look on his face shifted slightly. She could see him recalibrating. Not the way Wade recalibrated, with the genuine open adjustment of a man who was taking in new information. The way someone recalibrates when they encounter an obstacle they did not plan for and are deciding how to manage it. "That's between me and Mercer," he said. "Not anymore," she said. The silence stretched. A horse somewhere in the barn made a sound. The March wind was cold but not vicious. The worst of winter had passed, and what was left of it was more tired than mean. Thornton looked at her steadily. She returned it. "You're the one who built the case?" he said finally. Not a question. The flatness in his voice was not quite admiration and not quite contempt. It was the voice of a man identifying a fact he would have preferred to be different. "Yes," she said. You've been here, what, 3 months?" 14 weeks, she said. He looked at her for another long moment. She could see him thinking about something, some reconsideration, some adjustment he was making in real time to a picture he had drawn some time ago and was finding imprecise. He had seen her on the platform. He had heard she was nobody from nowhere, the dead gambler's girl, too big and too plain and too powerless to matter. He had walked away. "That was a mistake," she said. Not aggressive, just clear. He blinked. She had said aloud the thing he had been thinking, and that had surprised him, and she watched him absorb the surprise and then, after a moment, do something she had not expected. He let a fraction of the control in his expression go, just a fraction. Enough for her to see that underneath the substantial, managed exterior of Samuel Thornton was a man who had believed, for a very long time, that power meant being the one who saw things clearly when others didn't. She had seen more clearly than he had. She had been on a platform in his county, purchased for $600, and she had walked into a failing ranch and read its books and understood its wound before he knew she was looking. He said, "I'd still like to speak with Mercer." "I'll get him," she said. She went inside and through the kitchen and out the back to the barn, where Wade was with the colt, and she said, "Thornton's here. He came alone. He wants to talk." Wade looked up from the colt. His expression was very still. "What does he want?" "He didn't say. But he's not," she considered. "He doesn't look like a man who came to threaten anything. He looks like a man who came because he's run out of other options, and he's trying to figure out if there are terms." "Terms," Wade said. "That's my guess," she said. "You don't have to give him anything. Greer's case doesn't require it, but it's your call." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him work through it. The weight of 4 years of a ranch slowly bleeding out. The cattle he hadn't known were gone. The barn he had thought was an accident. She watched him hold all of that and make a decision about what kind of man he was going to be when he walked out of this barn. "I'll talk to him," Wade said. She nodded. "Come with me," he said. She looked at him. "Elena," he said, with a patience that was very deliberate, "that man has been in this county for 20 years, and he underestimated you for 3 of the minutes he spent in it. I would like for him to see you standing next to me when I tell him what's going to happen next." She understood what he was saying. She thought about the auction yard, the platform, the $600. She thought about Thornton's smirk, carved into his face like something permanent. "All right," she said. They walked out of the barn together. Thornton was still on his horse at the porch steps. When they came around the corner of the house, his eyes went to Wade first and then to Elena, and she watched him take in the fact that she was there, standing beside Wade, not behind him, not in the doorway of the house, but beside him. And she watched the last of his recalibration complete itself. Wade said, "Get down off the horse." Thornton dismounted. "You want to talk," Wade said. "So talk." Thornton looked at them both. Then he said, "I can settle this without a trial. Financial restitution, the cattle that were recovered. I'll sign over the water access rights you've been disputing on the South Creek. Full settlement." In exchange for what? Wade said. Greer drops the criminal case, Thornton said. Or you advocate that he does. Greer doesn't work for me, Wade said. You have influence with him. Everyone can see what you're... Thornton stopped, started again. What happened here gave you standing with the sheriff's office that you didn't have 6 months ago. Wade looked at him steadily. What you're describing is asking me to use the evidence that was collected to expose your crimes as leverage to make those crimes go away. Thornton said nothing. That's not something I'm going to do, Wade said. The restitution? The court will determine restitution, Wade said. I'll take what the court awards. He paused. And I'll testify to everything that's in the documentation when I'm asked to. Another silence. The March wind moved between them. Thornton looked at Elena. She met his gaze without expression. She did not feel what she had expected to feel in this moment. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not anything with a clean name. She felt tired, mostly, and clear, and certain in the way you're certain when you have done something hard and done it right, and don't need anyone to tell you so. You should go, she said to Thornton. You came here to see if there was something to negotiate. There isn't. Go talk to your lawyer. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something that surprised her. The second time in this conversation, he had done something she hadn't expected. He nodded. Just once. Not in submission and not in respect, exactly, but in the acknowledgement of someone who has encountered a situation that has resolved against them and is acknowledging the resolution. He mounted his horse. He rode out the way he'd come. Elena and Wade stood in the yard and watched him go. After a moment, Wade said, You told Samuel Thornton to talk to his lawyer. Yes, she said. He's the most powerful man in this county. He was, she said. Wade looked at her. That thing in his expression that she had never quite found a name for. She was beginning to think, standing here in the March cold watching the dust of Thornton's departure settle on the road, that the reason she hadn't named it was that she recognized it and was not ready to say what it was. Come inside, she said. It's cold. They went in. The letter from the county court arrived 6 days later, and with it came the formal summons for Elena Voss to appear as a primary witness in the case of the Territory versus Harlan Pike and Samuel Thornton in Hardale, on a date 6 weeks away. She read it at the kitchen table with her coffee. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket, where she kept things that mattered, and she went to the stove and started on breakfast. Eli came downstairs while she was working and said without preamble, Can I do the cornbread today? Yes, she said. Measure the cornmeal first, don't guess. He got out the flour and the pan with the focused, slightly self-important air of someone who has been trusted with a task they take seriously. She watched him from the corner of her eye. The careful measuring, the small frown of concentration, the way he muttered to himself when he was working out the sequence. He looked, she thought, like a boy who was going to be all right. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but fundamentally, genuinely all right. She turned back to the stove. Outside, through the kitchen window, the March light was doing something complicated with the snow still on the peaks, catching it at an angle that made the mountains look briefly like something hammered out of silver. It lasted about 30 seconds, that light, and then it shifted and the mountains were just mountains again. She saw it and let it go and kept working, and the kitchen filled with the smell of cornbread, and the ranch moved around her into another ordinary morning, and 6 weeks from now she was going to stand in a courthouse in Hardale and say out loud, in front of witnesses, exactly what she had found in the books of a failing ranch that was not actually failing, what she had seen clearly when no one expected her to be looking. She was ready. The courthouse in Hardale was larger than she had expected. She did not know why that surprised her. Hardale was the county seat. It handled the business of a substantial territory. Of course, the courthouse was large, but she had built a picture of it in her head during the 6 weeks of preparation, some modest, practical building that matched the modest, practical scale of everything else she had been dealing with, and the reality of it, the stone facade, the double doors, the steps that made you feel the weight of the occasion, whether you wanted to or not, landed differently than the picture. She stood on those steps for a moment before going in. Wade was beside her. Lou was behind them both, because Lou had been subpoenaed as a witness and had put on a clean coat that she had never seen him wear before and had not commented on. Ready? Wade said. I've been ready for 6 weeks, she said. She went up the steps. The trial itself took 2 days. She had expected it to feel larger than it did. Some cinematic confrontation, the kind of reckoning that matched the weight of what she had been carrying for months. What it actually felt like was meticulous and procedural, and in its own way, exhausting. The prosecutor was a precise, dry man named Alberson, who had read her documentation so thoroughly that he occasionally referred to specific page numbers from memory, which she found both reassuring and slightly unnerving. She testified on the morning of the first day. She sat in the witness chair and answered Alberson's questions in the same plain, sequential way she had answered Greer's. What she had found, where, when, in what order, with what documentation to support each finding. She did not editorialize. She did not look at Thornton's table more than once, and when she did look, she found him watching her with an expression that had evolved since the ranch yard into something she could only describe as resignation. The smirk was entirely gone. She could not locate it anywhere in his face. Thornton's lawyer tried to suggest, during cross-examination, that she had misinterpreted entries that were within the bounds of legitimate ranch management, that her inexperience with frontier operations made her an unreliable reader of industry-specific financial records, that 14 weeks on a ranch did not constitute expertise. She answered each question directly, without defensiveness, citing specific entries and specific figures. She had anticipated this line of questioning and had spent 2 evenings of the 6 weeks preparing for it, writing out the logical chain of each finding so clearly that it could withstand the argument that she was young, female, and had arrived at the ranch in circumstances that Thornton's lawyer was obviously hoping the court would find relevant to her credibility. The court did not find it relevant. Lou testified after her, confirming the cattle count and the missing herd he had noticed 8 months prior. When Thornton's lawyer attempted to suggest that Lou's account was colored by loyalty to his employer, Lou looked at him with the flat, weather-worn patience of a man who had been doing difficult work for 40 years and said, "I can count cattle. I've been counting cattle since before you were born. The numbers I gave you are the numbers I counted." The lawyer moved on. Harlan Pike testified on the second day. She had not seen him since the afternoon Greer's deputy had brought him up the ranch road. He looked smaller still now, the particular deflation of a man who has made his decision about cooperation and is living in the aftermath of that decision. He confirmed the sequence, named Thornton, named Cleet, gave dates and amounts, and the specific arrangements he had been operating under. He said it all in the flat, careful tone of someone who has negotiated his own penalty down to a number he can live with and is now delivering the agreed-upon payment. She watched his face while he testified and thought about what Mara had said, that he had fixed Eli's kite, that he had spent an hour on a broken string for a child. She held both things at once and did not resolve them into something simpler because she had learned, in 18 years of watching people be complicated, that the resolution was usually a lie. The verdict came on the afternoon of the second day. Harlan Pike, guilty on 4 counts. The penalty was a combination of restitution and a term in the territorial prison that his cooperation had reduced but not eliminated. Samuel Thornton, guilty on 3 counts, including the insurance fraud, which carried the heaviest penalty. His land holdings, to the extent they had been acquired through fraudulent means, were to be reviewed by a territorial land officer. He would not go to prison. His lawyer had been expensive and effective, but the financial penalties were substantial, and the review of his land holdings was, as Alberson explained to Wade afterward in the courthouse corridor, likely to be very thorough and very uncomfortable for a man whose empire had been built partly on the same methods he had been using on Mercer Ranch. Wade shook Alberson's hand. Lou stood to the side and nodded once at nothing in particular, the gesture of a man closing a chapter. Elena stood in the courthouse corridor with the noise of it moving around her and felt, finally, the thing she had not let herself feel in 6 weeks of preparation. The particular quiet relief of having done something hard all the way through to the end and found it solid. Not perfect. Thornton was not in prison. The 42 head of cattle recovered was not the 63 that were gone. The $900+ in fraudulent payments would be returned in restitution, but the months of strain on the ranch's operations, the decisions Wade had not been able to make because the money wasn't where it should have been, that was not recoverable. Loss has a cost beyond its dollar amount, and she understood that clearly. But the thing that had been happening had been stopped. Named and stopped and put in front of people who had the authority to say, this is what it is, and it ends here. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the thing that mattered most. They rode back to the ranch over 2 days, stopping at a way station on the first night. Lou slept in the stable with the horses, which was his preference. Elena had a room that was small and cold and completely adequate, and she slept in it deeply, without waking before dawn for the first time in months. In the morning, over breakfast that neither of them had made, Wade said, "I want to talk about the contract." She looked at him across the table. "The 2-year contract," he said. "I want to change it." She set down her coffee. "To what?" He was looking at the table, the particular quality of a man who has thought through what he wants to say many times and is still finding the actual saying of it more difficult than the thinking. "I want to dissolve it," he said, "the labor contract. Formally, with Hoskins or whoever needs to be involved." He looked up. "And I want you to stay anyway, not because of a contract, because—" He stopped. She waited. "Because Mara told me she asked you if you were going to stay," he said, "and you said you didn't know, and I've been—" Another stop. "I should have said something before now. I know that. I've been—" "Wade," she said. He looked at her. "I know what you're saying," she said. "I haven't actually said it yet," he said. "I know," she said. "Say it anyway." He looked at her across the table in the way station breakfast room with the cold morning light coming through the window and the sound of Lou doing something practical in the stable, and he said, "I want you to stay because this is where you belong. Because Mercer Ranch is better with you in it. Because my children are better. Because I—" He took a breath. "Because I have been better. Since the day you got in that wagon. And I don't know the right way to say that to someone I bought a labor contract on, and I know how that sounds, and I know it's complicated, and I'm asking anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. The truth was that she had known this conversation was coming for a while. She had seen it building in the particular quality of the silences between them, in the way he said her name, in the thing in his expression she had refused to name for months, because naming it meant deciding what to do about it, and she had not been ready to decide. She was ready now. "Dissolve the contract," she said. "And yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes, to which part?" "To staying," she said. "I'm staying." His expression did the thing it rarely did. Let something through that wasn't managed or compressed. Just the plain relief, and something warmer than relief, of a man who has asked a question he was genuinely afraid might go the other way. She picked up her coffee and drank it and looked out the window at the cold morning, and she thought about Mara's plain declaration in the kitchen, "I want you to stay," and about Eli's flour-covered hands and Lou's reliable patience and the crack in the bedroom window that Wade had finally fixed, and about the road out of town she had not looked back on 4 months ago, and about what it meant that the place you ended up was sometimes better than anything you could have planned. Not perfect, not smooth, not the life you thought you were going to have. Better, in the ways that turned out to matter. The spring came slowly that year, the way it often did on the mountainside of the valley, reluctantly, in fits and starts, 3 warm days followed by a late frost, the snow retreating and returning and finally retreating for good sometime in April. By May, the ranch looked different, not transformed. That was not how real things worked, and Elena had no interest in the version of this story where everything became simple once the villain was removed. The work of rebuilding what had been quietly dismantled over 14 months was actual work, done incrementally, with limited resources and the ordinary complications of weather and animals and equipment that broke at inconvenient times. Cobb left in March for reasons of his own, and they were short a hand through the spring. The water rights dispute on the South Creek still required legal follow-through that moved at the speed of county bureaucracy. 2 of the recovered cattle were in poor condition and required attention that took time away from other things. But the bleeding had stopped, and it turned out that a ranch that was being bled, once the bleeding stopped, had more capacity than anyone had fully seen. The real operations of Mercer Ranch, the land, the herd, the decades of careful management that Wade had put into it before the fraud began. Those were sound. They had always been sound. They had just been obscured by a sustained campaign to make them appear otherwise. Lou hired a new hand in April, a young woman from a homestead that had failed 2 counties over, who arrived with a specific set of skills related to cattle medicine that Lou described, in his economical way, as useful. Her name was Petra. She was quiet and competent, and seemed entirely unbothered by the fact that the person managing the household accounts and coordinating the supply orders was an 18-year-old who had arrived at the ranch as a purchased labor contract. This was something Elena noticed more broadly that spring. The valley had made its assessment, not unanimously. There were people who had their opinions about the Voss girl and the circumstances of her arrival and what her presence at the ranch meant or didn't mean, and those people were going to have those opinions regardless. But the general weight of the valley's judgment, as she encountered it in town and in the conversations Lou and Dex carried back from their runs, and in the letters that occasionally arrived from neighbors, had landed on the side of the things she had done rather than the circumstances she had arrived from. Margaret Selby told her directly, in the dry goods store in April, that 3 families in the valley had quietly begun to look more carefully at their own books after the Thornton case. "You made it respectable to check," Margaret said, "to actually sit down and check whether what you're being told matches what you can see. People were afraid of looking like they didn't trust their own men. You made it about the numbers, not the trust." Elena had not thought about it that way. She stood in the dry goods store and thought about it. "It is about the numbers," she said finally. "The numbers don't have feelings about being read. They just tell you what happened." Margaret smiled. "I'm going to embroider that on something," she said. Mara turned 13 in May. For the birthday, Eli made the cornbread himself, without supervision, and it was almost right, slightly too dense, the edges slightly too dark. The kind of result that a 12-year-old who has been practicing produces when he is trying too hard. He stood over it with the anxious investment of someone waiting for a verdict. Mara ate 2 pieces and said it was good. It was not entirely good, but the saying of it was true in the way that mattered, and Elena watched from across the table and thought, "That's it. That's the thing. That's a family." Not the family any of them had planned on or asked for or would have designed if they'd been given the choice. A man who had spent 4 years retreating into his own loss. 2 children who had raised each other in the space their father's grief had vacated. And a girl from an auction yard who had arrived with 1 bag and a coat that was inadequate for the altitude and a method for reading numbers that turned out to be the thing the ranch needed most. What they had built together was not a picture of ease. It had arguments. Mara and Elena had 3 significant ones in the spring alone, about matters ranging from the practical to the philosophical, and resolved them with the particular difficulty of 2 people who are too similar in certain respects and too different in others. Wade and Elena had their own frictions, places where his long habit of managing alone pushed against her inclination to make decisions based on what the numbers showed, regardless of how those decisions felt. She was not always right. He was not always right. There were weeks where the working out of those differences was more work than anything else. But they worked it out. That was the thing. They were people who worked it out. In June, the labor contract was formally dissolved. Hoskins drove out to the ranch to handle the paperwork himself, which she suspected was not strictly necessary, but which Hoskins apparently felt was appropriate given the circumstances. He sat at the kitchen table with his papers and his brown coat and his pipe tobacco smell, and he went through the legal language with the same flat procedural voice he had used in his office the previous fall, and Elena signed where she was told to sign. When it was done, Hoskins looked at her over his papers with the expression of a man who was making a private assessment he was not going to share. Then he said, in an offhand way that was not quite as casual as he intended it to sound, "I told Wade Mercer about the ledgers you brought in, back in the fall." "I know," she said. "He told me." "I thought it was worth mentioning," Hoskins said, "to him, what you'd put together." He paused. "You were right that Henderson should have looked at it more carefully, the proposal you brought in." She looked at him. "He was wrong not to," Hoskins said. Which was, she understood, as close as Hoskins was going to come to saying that the system that had put her on a platform in an auction yard had also been the system that ignored a reasonable proposal from a girl it had decided didn't count. He was not going to say it outright, but he was saying it. "Thank you," she said. And she meant that too, the same way she had meant the thank you to Wade in the way station breakfast room, without complication, without the armor she had worn around gratitude for most of her life. Hoskins gathered his papers. He left. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after his wagon disappeared down the road, and she thought about standing in his office in the fall, with her father 3 weeks in the ground, and the farm already tagged, and a proposal she had spent 3 nights writing that he had read and not acted on. She did not feel anger about it. She had felt anger at the time, and it had been legitimate, and she had carried it through the winter like a coal she cupped in her hands to stay warm. But anger at the shape of things is exhausting to maintain, and she had needed that energy for other things. What she felt now was closer to clear-eyed acknowledgement. The world had arranged itself in ways that had required her to take the hardest possible road to arrive at the place she had arrived. The road had been genuinely hard. It had also made her the person who could read what was in those ledgers, who could sit in a courthouse in Hardale and answer a lawyer's challenges with specific page numbers and not flinch. You didn't get one without the other. That was the thing nobody told you when they were sorry for your hardship, that the hardship and the capacity were the same material, just shaped differently. She didn't know if that was fair. She suspected it wasn't, or not entirely. But it was true, and she had learned over 19 years and 4 months of being alive that true was more useful than fair, even when fair was what you deserved. On a July evening, late, when the summer had finally committed itself and the mountains held the last light longer than seemed possible, Elena sat on the porch steps. Wade came out and sat beside her. They did this sometimes, in the evenings, when the work was done and the children were in bed and the ranch settled around them into its nighttime sounds. They didn't always talk. Sometimes they just sat. Tonight he said, "Mara wants to learn the accounts." Elena turned to look at him. "She came to me yesterday," he said. "Said she wanted to understand how the books worked, how to read them." He paused. "She said you'd made it clear they were important." Elena looked back at the mountains. The last of the light was doing something remarkable up there, amber going to rose going to the deep blue that preceded dark. "She's old enough to start," Elena said. "That's what I told her." "She'll be good at it," Elena said. "She has the patience for it, and she doesn't like to miss things." "No," Wade said. "She doesn't." The evening settled. Below the porch, the ranch lay in its summer state, the green that the spring had finally produced, the cattle in the east pasture, the repaired barn roof, the water troughs that no longer froze. Evidence, all of it, of the ordinary, difficult, continuing work of keeping something alive. This was what she had not expected when she was 18 years old and standing in an auction yard. That surviving was not the ending. That what came after surviving was the long, unspectacular, deeply necessary work of building. That building was harder than surviving in certain ways because it asked you to believe in something beyond just getting through, and believing, actually believing, not just going through the motions, required a kind of courage she had not fully understood she possessed until she was here, on this porch, in this July evening, with the mountains holding their last light. She was 19 now. She had a room with a properly sealed window. She had children who weren't hers by blood, and were, anyway, in every way that the word actually meant something. She had a man beside her who had learned to say the hard things directly, even when it took him a while to get there, which was better than saying them easily. She had 4 ranch hands and a dry goods store owner who called her by her first name, and a county on record as having heard her testimony and found it credible. She had accounts she understood, and the standing to act on what they told her, and a 12, now 13-year-old girl who wanted to learn. What she did not have was the farm her father had lost, the mother who had died when she was 6, the 3 nights of work she had put into a proposal that a man in a brown coat had let sit until it was too late, the version of her life that might have happened if Georg Voss had been a different kind of man. She had this instead. "You're thinking," Wade said. "I'm always thinking," she said. "I know," he said. "What about?" She considered how to answer that, how to put into words the specific shape of what she was sitting with. Not grief, not satisfaction, not any single thing with a clean label. "About how the worst thing that happened to me was standing on that platform," she said. "And how if it hadn't happened, I wouldn't be here." I was quiet for a moment. "Does that make it all right?" "No," she said. "It wasn't all right. It was wrong in ways that Hoskins half acknowledged in my kitchen, and that's probably as close to an accounting as it's going to get." She paused. "But what I have now is real, and I built it. Whatever I had to go through to get here, I built what's here." He reached over and took her hand, not dramatically, just the ordinary gesture of someone who has decided and has been clear about the decision and doesn't need to make a speech about it. She let him hold it. The mountains went dark. The stars came up over the valley, the clear mountain altitude stars that she had learned were one of the reliable rewards of living at this elevation. Below, the ranch was quiet and whole. She had been bought for $600. She had built something that no amount of money could have purchased because it was not the kind of thing you could buy. The trust of people who had watched her work and decided she was worth trusting, the knowledge she had built through years of paying attention to numbers and people and the shape of things that were going wrong, the understanding that strength was not the absence of hardship, but what you carried forward through it and what you chose to do on the other side. Nobody had given her any of that. It had cost her every hard year she had lived. It was hers completely. And in the end, that was the thing about being underestimated. It only worked if you accepted the estimate. Elena Voss had never accepted it. Not at 6, learning to cook because her mother was gone. Not at 12, tracking her father's accounts because someone had to. Not at 18, on a platform in a yard, with a man in a good coat watching her from the edge of the crowd and deciding she was nothing to worry about. She had been something to worry about all along. She just needed a place to show it. The summer night settled around Mercer Ranch, and the woman on the porch steps held the hand of the man beside her, and inside the house a 13-year-old girl was already, almost certainly, planning how to begin.